Nic is CISO at Edal Consulting, who offer virtual CISO services. So we've seen a massive explosion in the amount of virtual CISO services on offer. Why do you feel it's such an important service?
I think security is one of those topics that it's in a rare band where it kind of applies to pretty much every company of every size. But what you have to do about it varies greatly depending on the size of your business, the type of work that your company does, the type of data that you hold. So I think it's led to a lot of people sitting there saying, we know we need to do something, but we don't know what. And in the current market, hiring people full-time is very expensive. If you hire the wrong person, that's not great because you've put your trust in someone to deliver you a assurance that this problem is solved, and if it's not solved, you've still got all that risk. And so I think the model of being able to bring in more of a sort of consulting advice, here's what you need to do, here's the extent of the problem for your business, and also I think one of the key things that's being offered is here's the level that you need to go to. There's always more that you can do. Security is going to be, it's one of those never-ending tasks, but at the same time it has very strong diminishing returns. The more you do isn't necessarily equal to how much safer you become. Past a certain point, you're just generating extra work for very little added benefit.
How do you think smaller companies can compete with larger organizations when it comes to their security? And I'm thinking particularly around how tenders for project work or bids will ask about security. How do smaller companies then compete on that scale?
I think the first thing to understand if you're a small business is that you're actually at an advantage. The immediate assumption is that you have no money, you have no budget, and therefore you can't do security, is the completely wrong way of looking at this. I think in many cases, what you should look at is security budget is there as a sort of safety net to fix the holes in your company. And as a very small business, you actually can quite fairly simply implement strong controls that mean that you don't really have these holes. As such, you don't need to be spending huge amounts of money on additional security kind of monitoring expenses and sort of like a really big sort of external outsourced security kind of MSSP, like a managed security provider. As a small business, you have the fundamental things of what data you hold, where it is, and who should have access to it. There are a few of the really key components that the bigger you get, those simple questions become harder and harder to answer. Walk into a bank and say, tell me what your most prioritized assets are and who in the firm should have access to them. That would take them a long time to come up with that information because their business has gotten so complex. The simplicity actually really helps your security. And the second thing is the cloud. So as a small business now, cloud services are great because actually you are getting not just the service, but you're getting the support for that service built in. And so when you actually look at, say, Office 365 as an email solution, it's more secure than any on-premise Exchange server that you could be able to set up and run yourself because you've got Microsoft and all of their experience offering that service and the security behind it. As a small business, all you need to do is secure your accounts for that. So if you're on Office 365, you're not going to get hacked because someone hacks Office 365. You're going to get hacked because someone guesses your username and password. That's how you're going to be attacked, and that's a very solvable problem. Stopping that happening is a case of making sure that you've got strong passwords, making sure that you've got multi-factor authentication. Those are very manageable, very cheap controls that any business can implement, not trying to secure an entire mail server, internet-facing set of infrastructure that has a lot more vulnerability associated to it and a lot more access to it.
What do you think smaller companies are most concerned with when it comes to security and data protection?
I think I think reputational damage is something that they should consider, but at the same time, I don't think we're actually at a point where I don't think we're at the point where companies really do get blamed for cyber breaches, which is good and bad. I think if you're a small business, you can use that to say, well, everyone else is getting hacked, so it wasn't really our fault. I debate the logic of that in some ways, but it means that the reputational impact, I think, on smaller businesses is still there, and it should be considered. But I think the thing that you should worry about, that a lot of companies sort of look past, is you are still small enough that if you don't have appropriate controls in place, someone could wipe out your business. So I'm really talking about here like ransomware. You see companies where they haven't backed up their data, and something comes in and takes a copy of all of their company records and encrypts it. And that's a real problem, because that is data that is essentially the core of your business that you've lost access to, and there is no backup. Now, if you had a backup, this would not be a problem. You would just basically get rid of the encrypted data, restore, and you'd be back up and running a day or two later. But just from not having that one process in place, that goes from being a minor incident that you're past in 24 hours to being a potentially company-ending incident because you've lost your core company data. I mean, there are cases of this happening to companies that provide website hosting, and they have lost all of their clients' websites, and there's no backups for them. And so they're sitting there as a company, their job was to store and host these websites. They now no longer exist. No one is going to go to that company anymore. And so I think without some simple steps in place, the effect that a cyber attack can have on a small business is huge. But with just simple steps, you can minimize that all the way down to being okay, this happened, we dealt with it quickly, we've moved on, we didn't really notice the impact. Like, that's the difference in the impact that these attacks can have, depending on how prepared you are.
What we've seen a lot over the past few months is that when a larger company's been breached, it's been via a smaller third-party supplier. So do you feel like the level of security that a smaller company will need is going to change?
I think that depends on what sectors you're in and how targeted those sectors are. So to some extent, yes. It works on both sides. If you're a big company and you're providing access to a small company, you should have the controls in place to make sure that access can't be abused regardless. So there's a failing on that side there. But yes, as a smaller business, if you are still selling into larger businesses that are going to be targets, you need to recognize that your access to that business makes you a target. Defense sector is a fantastic example of this, right? So if you look at the production line for a modern military piece of technology, whatever it be, whether it be a plane, a ship, a missile, those production lines go out to the smallest manufacturing companies all over. But if you're BAE Systems or Raytheon, you have to manage that entire supply line, because there are people who are very interested in what you hold, and they will work their way all the way from the bottom up. So yeah, you've got now these really small manufacturing companies that are having BAE Systems rock up with a sort of cyber security due diligence questionnaire and say, we need you to fill this in if you want this contract. And for those companies, that's a massive step up. They've gone from doing nothing to all of a sudden having their major provider, their major customer say, here is now basically a contractual requirement that you have to meet if you want this deal.
And do you feel GDPR has helped with that awareness?
I think it has. I think GDPR has been one of the reasons that companies now recognize they need to do something. And interestingly, this is more of a personal observation, but I find that the companies who need to do the most are sometimes the most oblivious, and the ones who are the most active in looking to do something are sometimes the ones who have the easiest problem. So you look at companies that mostly do business-to-business selling, they don't collect, they don't store bulk personal data. They will have maybe a CRM of business contacts, which, yes, it has some personal data in it. There are email addresses and other bits of personal data, and that should be protected. But the sensitivity of that compared to, there are companies out there bulk harvesting, especially if you're running like web platforms, the amount of data mining you're doing on your visitors, companies that are selling like free platforms that do like collect personal data off people's phones, have stuff inputted, that's valuable. I think GDPR has finally meant that companies have had to look at that and say, what is the value of this data and what's the value if it's lost? And finally they've got a way of pricing that other side. So previously they would say, well, we've got all this data, it's the core of our business, but to secure it properly, it's too expensive. There's no sign off for a project of that size because they haven't done the required steps they needed to do. Finally, GDPR has said, well, actually, if you don't do that, your potential cost to your business is far greater than the cost of actually doing security. And it's helped, I think, weigh that balance back. I think the way I would summarize it is a lot of businesses take what is essentially our data and then they say, but we are not going to protect it properly because we don't think it's worthwhile for our business to do that. And GDPR has said, that's not your decision to make anymore. If you are holding other people's data, you are required to protect it to at least a basic standard. And again, like GDPR's security requirements are not like excessively onerous from a sort of breach perspective. They are, what you really should be doing because that data has value, and if you leave it unprotected, people will come after it.
Back in the summer, we heard a lot about people saying, I'm GDPR compliant, but it's obviously an ongoing process. Do you think people or the clients you're working with, do you think they've realized that?
Again, I think most, the sensible ones, have treated this as, how do we build, it's very same to kind of like core security. If you treat this as an ongoing issue that your business needs to really get a hold of and grip and take a long-term approach to, you'll be in a much better position. You looking at it as a point-in-time compliance is just going to give you a sort of 12-month cycle of you sign off a bunch of stuff, in 11 and a half months you come to look at it again, you panic, you do a load of work, you get to a point where you sign off. Everyone grows to essentially hate that. They don't like that as an approach. It generates the same work and, it's not going away. The regulations are only going to go in one direction, which is to get tougher because this data is becoming more and more valuable. Like, the more data you collect on people, the more valuable it is for someone else to steal that, the more you're going to have to do to protect it. But like I said, I think the bar isn't that high, and I think if you approach it with that annual compliance view, you're always going to be looking up at where you need to be. Whereas if you approach it with a long-term mentality, you're more recognizing that you're probably actually going to be above where you need to be, and it's then you've got some safe space, where actually if the regulations do get a bit tougher, you don't have to change what you do because you're already in excess of what you needed.
Now, you started your career in security in the UK government. Do you feel that as a country we're prepared for the risks we're facing?
No. I think if people knew just how badly their data was protected, people would riot. So between my experience and the experience of friends of mine that work in incident response, who work in sort of much more targeted intrusion stuff at sort of security companies, the amount of times major, like not every major company, but major companies who you'll have all heard of have a breach, and just their response to it is to basically take a very legal approach and say, well, the main thing is that it doesn't get out. Their approach has been, it must not hit the press. It doesn't matter how bad the breach was. And actually, their primary focus isn't even stopping the breach sometimes. Their primary focus is preventing knowledge of the breach getting out. And there are places that hold bulk personal data who have just done nothing to protect it and see no issue with that. And it scares me because I think we as I think the big issue, like, the view is that like cybersecurity has suddenly appeared in the last 5 years as a requirement, and that's not actually what's happened. Like, the issue is that over the last 10 years, we have built the majority of our economy on technology, but we don't really understand what it costs to maintain technology. So the idea would be, at the moment, you've got a whole bunch of companies, like to take an analogy of driving a car, they are driving their cars around until the tires burst, right? They are wearing them all the way down, tires are bursting left, right and center. The government's finally come in and said, actually, you know what? You're not allowed to drive cars which have unsafe tires. You need to replace your tires every 12 months. And some companies are now up in arms going, are you ridiculous? We have to change tires every 12 months. How expensive is that going to be? There are other companies that have been doing it every 12 months that have actually been doing this right and have had no credit for it. The noise comes from businesses that have clearly not taken security at any level of priority. They've not taken technology management at any sort of priority. They've collected this data and they have allowed essentially their information assets to atrophy. And yes, to turn something from basically a shipwreck back into like a floating boat, it's quite expensive. You shouldn't have ever let it get that bad. You know, global companies who are getting hit by these massive cyber attacks and then claiming it wasn't their fault are just flat out lying. It was their fault. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. And the fact that there was no one maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago saying, here's the risks from cyber. Yeah, but these flaws are fundamentally flaws in technology management, which is a profit-driven decision. The business has said, we're not going to spend money on this because we don't want to. That's become a problem, and they're now trying to say, it's not our fault. How could we possibly have known this would be a problem? Like, that's what a big business is in the sense of security risk. And the advantage that small businesses have is most of them don't have that issue. They're new, they don't have all this old IT, all this old legacy stuff. They can be so much more secure than big companies.
Now, you just said we'd riot if we knew how badly our data was protected. Do you think the general public actually cares, or do you think they're a little bit bored with hearing about another breach that they don't really understand in the news?
Oh no, yeah, I think people don't care. And the way that it's reported as, well, we mustn't blame the victim, so it's not their fault. If you put your money in NatWest and NatWest got robbed and it turns out they didn't actually keep the money in a vault, NatWest, to save money, had taken over, bought out a local library and were just stuffing the money in a cupboard, and it got robbed, you'd legitimately ask some questions about, well, why was that okay? Like, that's still, you've maybe covered my losses, but should that have ever happened in the first place? We got to the point where, if you go back in time, banks used to get robbed. They very rarely get robbed now, and if they do, it's by very specialist groups who can still get caught, still have real problems doing it. It's a problem that we didn't solve, but we reduced. Cyber's still at the very early phase of that, where all these breaches are happening. People never get reported why, so the assumption is you could do nothing to protect it. And I think if actually people were to write, here's the breach, here's why it happened, and here's why you've now got to have identity theft monitoring for the next 3 years, because people are going to start using your data and signing up for loans in your name, signing up for bank accounts in your name, and it's going to come through to your address, and the bills are going to come through to you, and all. They'd, I think, be more outraged. But that's not how it's reported. That's not what's discussed. It's discussed as, it's yet another breach, the company couldn't do anything, so what do I care? What can I do about it? Nothing. But yeah.
We hear a lot that you can't be 100% secure. So do you think we can reach a point like we did with bank robberies, where actually you're protected enough that it significantly reduces the attacks?
I think that's the goal to aim for. Again, if you think about the security at the Bank of England, who look after physical gold versus a major high street branch who might have money versus a local post office, they don't all have equivalent levels of security. And there's no reason in cyber that everyone should have equivalent levels of cybersecurity. but it's understanding what is the basic protection that people need and when do you need to go past that. And I think that's what actually the security industry at a whole has been very bad at telling people. Like, the industry has been heavily dominated by, and I say this, well, I mean, this is really, it's a vendor-led approach, which is technology-driven. You need to buy product X and make this problem go away. And that doesn't give you productive results. It involves you spending a lot of money, but not necessarily getting a lot out in assurance. But I think that's where you're starting to see this stuff go. So if you look at what, so the National Cybersecurity Centre, so this is the UK government's new security kind of body, the advice it's putting out is basic. It's not sending out hundreds of pages of technical documentation anymore. It's saying, here's 10 steps, 10 simple steps to becoming more secure. Like, and it's saying, you know, they've put out specific advice for the charity sector, for small businesses, and they're saying it's not about doing everything. It's about doing these things and doing them well. Don't try to do too much. If you're in this category of business where you don't hold credit card data, you're not like a major company, you're not in any of these sectors, this is what's appropriate for you. And I think the more that message beds in and the more that sort of filters out through places like IT providers and other sort of like embedded companies that work across those sectors, we'll get closer to it, I think.
So as we go into 2019, what do you see happening over the next 12 months? What are your predictions?
I think we will see, well, I think what you're likely to still see are more kind of big headline breaches from major companies. The thing that scares me is if we see a breach in one of the major cloud providers, because I hope that it doesn't happen, but the law of averages says at one point they will have a breach. Now, again, a breach and a breach can be very different things. Again, was it a minor breach that was dealt with quickly? Was it a major breach that compromised core systems and gave access to everything? But there's a lot of businesses now that are moving to the cloud, and that's a good thing. It gives them a lot of benefits, but a breach in one of those areas could just kill that confidence and actually set us back by getting people to move back on premise. And I think what you'll see is continued innovation in the e-crime area. So you're seeing, you know, what you're seeing is not necessarily, it's old style fraud tactics being moved into, you know, web and email based stuff, right? When you look at a lot of what happens, like they're not complex attacks. Some of these things that get labeled as cyber attacks are, I email a company and say, here's an invoice, please pay me money, and they pay me money, and that gets labeled as a cyber attack. And it's like, is it just because it was sent via email? But I think you're seeing innovation in the way that you extort businesses online. And it's the same fraud that's happened many, it's moved online, and the pool of people who can do it has gotten bigger. So I think that area is only going to keep growing.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with me this afternoon, and we've got some more interviews coming up.
Thank you.